Good evening, I'm Ita Buttrose, and I'm here tonight in my capacity as chairperson of the National Advisory Committee on AIDS. We're a committee set up by the Federal Health Minister, Dr. Neil Blewett, to provide a link between the government and the people. We're a communications and education committee. Now, there have been many documentaries shown on television about AIDS, but they've left a lot of questions unanswered. When we saw AIDS, Profile of an Epidemic, we felt it was one of the most comprehensive documentaries we'd seen on AIDS. And the National Advisory Committee has asked the 7 Network to screen it for you tonight. At the end of the documentary, I'll be joined by Professor Ron Penny from the AIDS Task Force, and we will bring you up to date with the situation in Australia.
Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, is an epidemic of staggering proportion. It has struck in more than 34 countries around the world. In the United States, Gerald Burrill is a Haitian living in New York City. Christopher Shahar, a gay man in Los Angeles. Kenneth Brown, an intravenous drug abuser from Chicago. David McKee, a hemophiliac living in rural Kentucky with his family. Amar Hamilton, a 6-year-old child in New York. 5 of the 1,000 struck by this disease, each without the natural immune defenses to prevent deadly infections and rare forms of cancer, all potentially fatal. For the moment, AIDS is incurable. The longer a patient has the disease, chances for survival dwindle dramatically. In the absence of intensive media coverage, some might be led to believe that the disease is leveling off. It is not. Many researchers would argue that the number of cases is actually 10 times higher than those reported by the Centers for Disease Control. When the AIDS alarm sounded 4 years ago, most people knew little or nothing about the disease, much less knew anyone who had it. Now, as the number of cases doubles every 6 months, that profile is changing, and so is the profile of AIDS. Research breakthroughs isolating the probable viral cause of the disease give new leads to the scientific community. New information, if not hope, for patients, loved ones, and the growing number of people touched by AIDS. I'm Edward Asner.
You know, they should just come out and tell people what meaning, like if they said through sexual intercourse or through blood. But the way they're going on, they figure if they touch a person, they could get AIDS. You know, got everybody scared.
At first, the AIDS scare was identified with homosexuals. The media called it the gay plague. The homophobic point of view was that AIDS victims were getting what they deserved.
My initial reaction was that it's all over. I mean, I'm going to die. And that's because the news media at that time was doing heavy push on AIDS. It was just starting to. And all you heard was the negative things of AIDS and statistics, nothing positive. And if you had AIDS, you were going to die, and that was it. If you lasted or lived for another 2 years, you were really stretching it.
Tragic stories mount. Family rejection, isolation, eviction, job firing. Cops geared up as if ready to do battle. Healthcare workers, ambulance drivers, refusing to touch people with AIDS.
In the very beginning, we had technicians that weren't interested in working with the disease. There were stories in certain hospitals about physicians refusing to treat patients, about technicians standing up and refusing to deal with blood samples. And because of all this, things became very difficult. And I think in the very beginning of this epidemic, the full exerted effort of a real team couldn't happen because of all of the concerns of a lot of people working with this disease.
Even the Journal of the American Medical Association published an article speculating that AIDS may be transmitted casually. It is not.
There are just so many misconceptions about it, and usually what makes the news is the worst, the most extreme cases.
In the United States, some rare cases of AIDS in adults and children have been attributed to blood transfusions. This heightened the threat. Were the blood banks contaminated?
Problems have been identified with blood transfusions, and patients have come down with AIDS related to transfusions, but the number of cases have been relatively small compared to the large number of blood transfusions that have been given in the U.S.
Some people started to stockpile their own blood. The federal government issued strong statements of reassurance, but the public was not easily convinced. At the same time, the national blood supply fell to dangerously low levels as potential donors refused to give.
Because there is a needle stick involved in the actual blood donation itself, many people have assumed that, well, maybe they could get AIDS from donating blood. The needles that are used in blood donors are actually sterile and are only used in one donor and then discarded. So there is really no possibility of being exposed to an infectious agent, whether it be AIDS or any other agent, through donation of blood.
In some cases, children acquire the disease from their mothers who have AIDS.
Most data point to an in utero transmission of the disease, so that the baby acquired the disease as a fetus, we can say, and was born already with the disease that then slowly evolved and developed all the symptoms.
Amar Hamilton's mother is an IV drug abuser with AIDS. Amar contracted AIDS from her. He's in the custody of his grandmother.
She had been in my house until she moved in her house. There I used to make her eat. But when she's by herself, she doesn't, you know, she doesn't have the willpower to do nothing. That's why I try to keep, you know, the kids away from as much as possible.
Amar struggles with one opportunistic infection after another and has lost most of his hearing. Dr. Brian Novick is his treating physician.
Amar is almost 6 years old now, and really that makes him one of the oldest children that has AIDS, one of the first children that was probably diagnosed with AIDS. And in the first 4 years or so of his life, he had several severe infections, including meningitis. He's had several episodes of pneumonia, and he's had other infections which have really debilitated him.
Doctors are trying to strengthen Amar's immune system with a course of intravenous gamma globulin. Some children respond to this therapy. So far, adults have not.
There is a difference between what we're seeing in adults with AIDS and children with AIDS. Really, the most obvious one is Amar, that Amar is 6 years old. There are probably very few adults that have lived this long with AIDS, whereas Amar is one of 2 or 3 children that are really around 5.5, 6 years that we're following, who are still alive and are clinically stable. This is much longer than many of the adults.
The social issues are as bad in children as in adults. If you, for example, have one child with AIDS in a family where there are other children, it's often so that the other children are excluded from schooling because of their contact with a sibling that has AIDS. There are situations where families had to move from their apartments because the neighbors found out that they had a child with AIDS, and they didn't want their children to play with a child that has AIDS or with siblings of a child who had AIDS.
When the teacher teaches him for the deaf, they have to use their hands. And other kids, they said if the teacher used their hand, they figured that something from him could, you know, other kids would catch it. So I told her I was foolish. I said, because I said the only way that it can contract anything, it'd have to be through sexual intercourse or through blood. And then they said to me, well, we'll let Amar stay home, and we'll send a tutor to him.
Currently, as you know, we are studying and treating 40 children with AIDS or with the AIDS-related complex. We are studying all the members of the family of these children, and especially the other children in the family or in the foster family. And so far, we could not document in any one of these families a second child that acquired the disease from the index patient.
I raised 4 kids of my own, and I know a certain precaution you have to take. I know well, all I can do is I use a lot of disinfectant around the house, and when a certain time I put on a glove, you know, certain things I put on the glove, and I don't feel I'm gonna get it.
The myth of the infectiousness of AIDS is also touched upon the children in a quite sad form. Most of the children, as I told you before, are coming from families where the mother, often also the father, are drug abusers. Most of these families are broken families where the parents don't live together and cannot care for the child with AIDS. Some of the parents abandoned those children in the hospital. And we have been involved for a long time in many of these children in the search for foster parents.
I was taking care of this baby ever since he was born, because I kept him with me as he wasn't a well baby, and I didn't, I want him to have the best of care. And after I found out that he was sick, I went to court. Now he is rewarded to me during court to make sure that he gets his food the way he's supposed to get it. And I know he is well taken care
of. By a barrage of foreign invaders, viruses, microbes, chemicals, particles, and substances of every kind. Most are blocked from entering the body's tissues. Outside, the body's tough elastic skin acts as a resilient shield. Inside, the fluids of the digestive system consume or expel many of these dangerous substances. And the mucous linings of the respiratory system also trap and eject them. Foreign invaders that do get in, as here through a cut in the skin, are called antigens. The immune system evolved to prevent antigens from taking over. Without natural immune defenses, the body would lose the constant battle against the microbial world. David, the boy in the bubble, lost that battle. He was born without any components of immune defense at all. He died of what is called severe combined immunodeficiency disease. It is inherited, it is not contagious, and it is even more profound than AIDS. Children with this disease must live from birth in a totally germ-free environment. For them, contact with even the most common germs and antigens can be fatal. Normally, a healthy immune system responds to them in a complex and elegant way that science is just beginning to understand.
And immunology is a very young science, and it's grown exponentially since the first major discoveries of immunoglobulins in the cellular immune system. But in fact, it's still a very young science, and for that reason, really the research and investigation of AIDS will parallel the growth of understanding of the human immune system.
This miracle of the human body has several remarkable characteristics. When it is working properly, it is able to identify what is and what is not part of the human body. It can combat infection and disease, and it can remember how, so that the next combat will be swifter and even more efficient. When an immune system is not working properly, a wide range of diseases can be unleashed. Allergies are an overreaction to a relatively harmless invader, like a pollen. Rheumatoid arthritis, a more serious disorder, occurs when the body mistakes its own tissues as foreign and attacks them. The major organs of the immune system are stationed throughout the body: tonsils and adenoids, thymus, spleen, appendix, bone marrow, and lymph nodes laced along an elaborate network of lymph vessels that merge with the bloodstream. Strings of these bean-shaped structures can be found in the neck, armpits, groin. The immune system deploys billions of immune cells. Sharing combat duties, they patrol the body and are able to trap, kill, and remove invaders. These lymphocyte immune cells play a major role in immune defense. They are small white blood cells. The T-cell lymphocytes are the captains. There are two types of T-cells: helpers and suppressors. Together, these captains issue and revoke orders to their troops, the B-cell lymphocytes. When an invader is present, it is first identified by helper T-cells. Then these cells send out chemical alarms, drawing B cells to the invasion site. B cells are chemical experts. When ordered into action by helper T cells, they produce lethal antibodies to combat and kill the antigen invader. Too much antibody can be harmful to the body. That's why suppressor T cells are needed to regulate the battle. Helper T cells issue orders for more antibody. Suppressor T cells countermand those orders until immune response is completely shut down. When the battle is over, the immune system remembers. The next time a similar antigen invades, defense can be faster and more efficient. Here is the process once again. Identification, alarm, antibody combat, regulation, shutdown. Normally, there are 2 helper T cells for every suppressor T cell. The AIDS agent appears to be attacking helper T cells, reversing the 2-to-1 ratio, and preventing the body from combating antigen invaders. When a person has AIDS, the body becomes vulnerable to a range of cancers and infections which can be fatal. People with healthy immune systems usually don't get AIDS diseases. That's why these diseases are called opportunistic. They take advantage of the weakened immune system. The cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, and the parasitic infection, Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, are the most common. Opportunistic AIDS diseases like these can be treated with some success. The earlier, the better. However, at present, the underlying immune suppression of AIDS remains incurable.
I don't think we have a great deal to offer the patient in terms of magic medicines. There's no penicillin for AIDS. I mean, there's no magic injection.
The Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, a public health service of the federal government, was among the first to document that something unusual was happening on the east and west coasts.
Back in early 1981, there were a few unusual requests for a drug called pentamidine isothianate, the backup drug to treat this rare pneumonia, Pneumocystis pneumonia. Some of these requests had come from New York City, and there was an unusual group of 3 or 4 such requests from Los Angeles, from UCLA Medical Center.
In early 1981 at UCLA, we evaluated 4 patients with unexplained fevers and marked weight loss. All 4 ultimately developed Pneumocystis pneumonia, an opportunistic infection which occurs only in individuals with compromised immune systems. At this point, we thought we had discovered a new, previously undescribed immune deficiency condition. All 4 of our original patients were gay males, and thus we considered the possibility that this was a transmissible immune deficiency.
Following the pattern of many infectious diseases, AIDS gradually spread from the coastal areas to the center of the country.
The slow start apparently is because of the onset of the epidemic on the coast. And Chicago had our first case really, I think, in 1982. But since then, we really are equaling the epidemic in the rest of the country.
Well, it's very possible that AIDS has been around for a long time, but clearly with just sporadic cases. When one looks back in the medical literature, one may find a case or 2, 10, maybe even 20 years ago that might now be diagnosed as AIDS. But clearly something happened in 1979, 1980 that caused this to really surface, in which we now have a major epidemic.
Filled with accounts of diseases that wiped out masses of people. They are often woven into myth. The Bible tells fantastic stories of pestilence. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague, called the Black Death, killed 25 million Europeans and left a lasting scar on the collective memory of that continent. In the 1950s, polio was marked by the specter of the iron lung. The March of Dimes burst upon the national scene and made its way door to door. Funds collected by volunteers were used to track down the polio virus and develop a vaccine. More recently, Legionnaire's disease was shrouded in an aura of mystery. It wasn't until a new bacterium was discovered that anyone knew what struck the Philadelphia conventioneers. AIDS has its own myths. The delays in finding the facts are attributed to prejudices against the groups AIDS most often affects: homosexuals, IV drug abusers, Haitians. Candlelight marches across the country added the element of urgency. They raised money for underfunded research and galvanized groups to respond with a measure of sanity and concern. In April 1983, the New York gay men's health crisis filled Madison Square Garden for a benefit performance of the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. In one night, they raised nearly $400,000. Proceeds went to AIDS research and support programs. As with all AIDS volunteer groups, the essential services and information they provide are not limited to gay people, but to everyone touched by AIDS.
We don't really know where it's going to hit next. So I think we all have to be very, very much involved in this.
It's a disease that must be cured.
Let us begin to find an end to acquired immune deficiency syndrome.
As far as the general public is concerned, I think they should realize that we are dealing with a new disease. We don't have all the answers. And because of that, that doesn't mean there needs to be mass hysteria. This disease does not appear to be highly contagious.
Intimate contact diseases are transferred by blood products and serum products, those contained in semen and blood.
The exchange of body fluids during male-to-male sexual contact is suspected to be the most common mode of transmitting AIDS in the United States.
This is a sexually transmitted disease, and that probably rectal intercourse, the insemination of the rectum, is more likely to result in trauma, which will open blood vessels for the inoculation, direct inoculation of the AIDS agent, while vaginal intercourse is more protected structurally, doesn't result in that trauma, and probably doesn't result in the same inoculation of infectious diseases.
According to federal statistics, 72% of all people with AIDS in the United States are homosexual or bisexual men. No cases of AIDS in homosexual women have been reported so far.
When the doctor did call me up and ask me to come in before office hours to have a consultation, I assumed that it was something drastically wrong. And when he said AIDS, my initial reaction was that it was nice knowing you. That's what I said to the doctor.
Christopher Shahar's AIDS was confirmed when he was diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma in November 1982. So far, this cancer is mostly confined to gay men with AIDS.
I sensed that something was wrong for the previous year or so. I hadn't felt right, and I didn't know whether it was just exhaustion, but my body didn't feel right. When I first was diagnosed and started coming to the hospital, it used to be a really terrifying experience, but now after almost a year and a half, it seems like an everyday occurrence. I can remember back the first time I was admitted as an inpatient for my interferon treatments, I was put into the laminar flow room, which is basically the room that they used in the movie like Boy with a Glass Bubble. And that was really terrifying. I had no idea what was going to be happening. And here I was put in this clear plastic room. And in order to do anything, I had to call the nurse. I wasn't allowed out of the room. Everybody could see into the room. People would walk by and kind of stop and look at you like, what's wrong with him? And it was really an awful experience.
Dr. Joel Weissman treats many AIDS patients in Los Angeles.
And by the time you get into the second year of treatment, the physical seems to be going smooth, and the treatment is for the physical, and then you have the psychological, like, where am I going, how long is this going to take, am I better, am I not better, do I live, or is death imminent? I had a very close friend come over for dinner, and when my friend came in, he said, can I catch it from the salad? And I just started laughing, and I kind of looked at him ready to throw him out because I didn't know whether he was serious or not. And he started laughing, and I said, it's funny because I just used gloves when I made the salad. And he looked at you, really? And it was just, myself getting phobic about the whole situation, which I knew you're not going to catch AIDS from tossing a salad. But yet at the same time, I said, well, just in case, I can't live with the fact of knowing, well, maybe it is. I've gotten over that.
But the reality is that's not a factor, and that it's, if we've gotten anywhere with the disease, we're dealing with the fact that it's not transmitted casually, that it's an intimate contact disease. I don't know what it would be like to go home and not be hugged. And that I can't always answer those questions.
It's not a good feeling.
Christopher is an outpatient at the UCLA Medical Center. Despite reduced levels of energy, he is still very active. So far, his cancer is being controlled with interferon treatments.
I'm not sure whether I have a fear of travel or not, but I definitely stick close to home and find that there's that security in being in the house, which is, a lot of it is very psychological, or all of it's psychological. There's no physical reason for staying, in the house or within a mile radius of the house. And it's very difficult to deal with waking up one day and being in a great mood and 2 days later, ready to slit your wrists, so to speak, in a figurative sense, and not knowing what's going to happen. And for that, I do need lots of support and get lots of support from friends and go to therapy once a week for the emotional support, which I feel is real, real important.
Nancy Cole is on the board of directors of the AIDS Project Los Angeles. She and Christopher met on a candlelight march and have become close friends.
I hate AIDS, the syndrome, the disease, what it does to people. I'm not necessarily thinking that a person going into a transition of life to death, that's not it. I hate the disease, I hate AIDS, I hate the fact that no one has been able to really get a grip on what this is and how to stop it. I mean, we're learning and everything, but I think that people, even within the gay community, that they're segmented. A lot of the gay community, some of them think that they blame it on certain lifestyles within the gay community, and it's not that at all. Everybody, it's a disease that's affecting human beings and people. I think what I hate most about it is the prejudice that it has created for no reason.
I've gotten calls from some people that were just diagnosed, and their biggest fear, which never entered my mind, was that AIDS is, to quote, like a sleazy disease. I mean, you have to be promiscuous, you have to be out on the streets, and that's why you get AIDS. And I mean, it's so off the wall.
And you don't have to be promiscuous.
Not
it
at all.
can be the one contact in a sexual act that is done with risk. Russian roulette.
Risk reduction, not celibacy, not having no sex. I don't think for most people, whether straight or gay, that's a viable alternative. And what we've developed with guidelines set up by many different organizations is forms of risk reduction. And basically, they talk about decreasing the number of sexual partners. They talk about not transferring body fluids, generally in those terms talking about semen or blood, possibly fecal matter which contains blood. I don't think that that we worry in terms of saliva, because if it was a saliva-borne disease, we would probably be seeing a quite different pattern than the pattern of intimate contact.
The New York Blood Center is studying the natural history of AIDS by tracking patterns of 1,000 gay men. Physical examinations, blood tests, and elaborate questionnaires about sexual activities are routine every 3 months for 3 years. Dr. Clad Stevens is in charge.
When these men come into our clinic, we will examine them physically. We'll take blood samples, which will be tested in our laboratories for evidence of infection with various viral agents, for example, and tests of their immune function as well.
Similar studies are underway in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore. It will take years before these studies reveal exactly who gets AIDS, to what degree, and why.
Many of the people who I've treated are people that I've been socially friendly with and have known over a course of 8 years. And I've had to deal with the death and dying of my patients and friends. And it takes its toll, and I don't think any physician who does this can do without therapy himself. And I certainly sought out that form of therapy in terms of dealing with the frustrations of the disease and not having a cure and having to deal on a repetitive basis with the fact that people are going to die from the disease.
In essence, you know them quite well. You try to help them deal with their AIDS and at the same time help them die. And it becomes a tremendous emotional burden for the physician. And I literally had to get away from it for a short time and just pull away, literally leave the country to sort of escape it all and come back and deal with it again on a better level for myself and for my patients.
Doctors are convinced that exposure to the AIDS agent does not always lead to the full-blown, life-threatening forms of AIDS.
Almost all infectious diseases are characterized by the fact that the majority of individuals exposed simply don't get sick. And one of the most fascinating problems in understanding infectious disease is understanding those things which determine who gets sick and who doesn't.
Presumably, most people that are exposed to an AIDS agent actually don't get the disease itself. If there were, there wouldn't be a few thousand patients with AIDS. There would be tens of thousands of patients with AIDS. And that's important, that there is probably something known as a herd immunity, that people are exposed to a low level of the agent, just as with any virus. They develop an immunity following that exposure and aren't prone to going on and developing the devastating kinds of things that AIDS could be.
People who do come down with AIDS are infected long before they know anything is wrong. At the onset of the disease, these early warning symptoms may appear. Fever lasting longer than a week or so. Steady weight loss not caused by dieting. Swollen lymph glands, especially in the neck, armpits, groin. Fatigue that will not go away. Shortness of breath or a dry cough for no apparent reason. Drenching night sweats. Fever during sleep, sudden changes in mood or personality, unexplained or persistent diarrhea. These symptoms may appear in any combination over time, but a word of caution. Any of these symptoms can be confused with the symptoms of common illnesses, colds, flu.
A person just doesn't get this disease by waking up in the middle of the night with 103 fever and the next day has pneumocystis pneumonia. Generally, you can trace back these other symptoms that have been mild but progressive over a period of months. It's not a disease that you snap your fingers and it happens the next day.
Kaposi sarcoma, the AIDS disease most often associated with gay men, is marked by purple or red lesions. Sometimes these lesions are internal, as in the case of Christopher Shahar.
The first sign that I had that something was wrong was the lymph nodes in my groin had swelled, and I had to go down and have them removed. And when they were biopsied, it came up positive as having Kaposi's.
I usually catch the flu at least once a year. That lasts about a week or two. But this time, in spite of all the medication and antibiotics that I took, I seem to be, I just kept getting worse.
My first symptoms was that I had started having night sweats and weight loss, and I had my foot operated on, and I'd been down for about 6 weeks and just started having trouble breathing, and I thought I had a little touch of pneumonia.
My first symptoms were these spots in my arms, back, chest, legs. I didn't know what they were.
17% of all people with AIDS in the United States are intravenous drug abusers, 4 men to every woman. AIDS can be transmitted by sharing needles contaminated with infected blood. The drugs themselves can be lethal health hazards. Kenneth Brown is hospitalized with AIDS in Chicago.
Well, I got TB when I came to the hospital. I didn't know that either, but I did a bone marrow test and found out.
Of all of the risk groups, I'd say that they are the least informed on the whole subject. And this is true has been observed in our emergency room, where commonly IV drug abusers will come for various minor complaints and really will have little idea when asked about AIDS and the implications of shooting drugs and the possibility of contracting AIDS.
I've been doing drugs since I was 14. I started shooting heroin when I was 18. When I was shooting heroin, there was everything in my life I couldn't stop. I very seldom worked. Used to steal to support my habit. It was very hard for me to stop taking drugs. I did them for most of my life. I really don't care that my friends are sharing needles, that they might get AIDS. I have to worry about myself. It didn't really bother me that I get AIDS from shooting heroin. You just don't care. You don't care.
When cholera broke out in 1832, it was attributed to decadence and immorality. Society blamed recent immigrants for the disease. In New York, this burden was shouldered by poor Irish people until someone figured out that the public water supply was contaminated. People with AIDS have also been stigmatized.
In this illness, there's an extraordinary amount of victim blaming, which is a terrible thing in any illness and is particularly terrible in AIDS. That's where people are simply blamed for their having the illness. There still is quite a bit of homophobia prevalent in this country. It's a group most people don't understand. Most people are either afraid of or, much like the moral majority fear, are somehow acting against God's will with their daily habits. IV drug users are the second most commonly affected group, and there again is a group that most people are fearful of, have no understanding of. IV drug abuse is a problem that people would simply like to blame on isolated individuals who like to enjoy themselves by shooting drugs as opposed to seeing it as yet another disease of substance abuse.
Nurses will shun them, physicians will shun them. They'll put on masks, gloves, and gear up as if they had the plague, and it's difficult to deal with. And then at the same time, they have to deal with dying.
People respond to AIDS like people respond to the diagnosis of cancer. I mean, especially the way people responded to cancer 10 or 15 years ago when I first started practice. They respond with fright, with denial, with hysteria. It causes all kinds of crises. For the homosexual patient, it brings about a crisis that they can't separate the disease from their dealing with their sexuality.
This gay man asked that his name be withheld in order to protect his legal action against a former employer.
6 months ago, I was diagnosed with AIDS. I had a job at that time. And as far as my physicians are concerned, I am functioning as a normal individual, and there is no reason for me not to work. But the company physicians have rejected that idea, and I just want the opportunity to be productive again and to live a full life. I do not accept the premise that I have to sit home and wait to die.
Do you read your English book every day, Amos?
4% of all AIDS cases in the United States are Haitians. Men outnumber women 7 to 1.
The Haitians are classified as a high-risk group by the Center for Disease Control. And unfortunately, the publicity from this has really had major adverse effect on the Haitian population.
The percentage of Haitian employment has plummeted over the past few months since this AIDS issue surfaced. It is unfortunate that this has happened because it has severely affected the financial and social life of the Haitians here in Dade County and elsewhere. It is utterly ridiculous to classify a nationality as a high-risk group. Haitians are being used as scapegoats.
Emotionally, it is now very difficult for anyone to be Haitian. Every Haitian would like something to be done because there is a deep sense of anger, frustration, shame, embarrassment.
We don't understand whether the Haitian population really is a member of a different risk group, but not acknowledging it, or in fact represent a distinct risk group with distinct risk factors that we just don't understand.
The medical advice I would give to Haitians is the same advice I would give to every patient. One, don't be promiscuous in your sex life. And number two, if you are addicted to substance, do everything possible to get help because you're playing with your life.
I feel like myself, I wish I knew where I got it. I have no idea. I am not an IV user. My only connection is that I'm Haitian.
Gerald had no exposures that we're aware of that would put him at risk for AIDS, and so he's an enigma to us, as have been all the other Haitian patients.
Gerald Burrill had been in and out of Beth Israel Hospital in New York several times before his AIDS was diagnosed with the onset of tuberculosis.
At first, they couldn't find out what it was. It was after a series of intensive testing that they found out that I had pulmonary tuberculosis. And a couple of days later, they came in and told me that I was also anemic and that I had developed a case of AIDS. At the time, it was my very first time that I heard of AIDS. I had no idea what it was. Each time that I've come here, I've gotten weaker. And that's my main worry right now, is just slowly getting weaker and weaker. I don't have any symptoms right now. Everything is fine, but still is this weakness, that frightens me. I've known AIDS patients that have died. As a matter of fact, I know 3 of them. The one that died recently while I was here, he died of the KS. And another one died of, I believe he just kept getting smaller and smaller. He died of dehydration. At first, I didn't believe it. The first time I was here, I didn't believe it. I didn't accept it. I didn't want to accept it. And I was very angry. I've gotten so angry that now I can hardly get angry anymore. I can hardly cry. I haven't been able to cry like I did in the beginning. I'm very sad and very fearful. And I feel very lonely, I feel like I've been dealt a bad hand here. I'm hoping my landlord doesn't see this, because I know for sure that he will kick me out if he finds out. That's one of my biggest fears. We're not at fault for having AIDS. That is just a misfortune. God didn't give it to us neither. It's just something, a freak of nature.
He's a physician. And his or her job is to think about the disease as it spreads through the community, to count the number of cases, to count where the cases occur, to count the circumstances under which the cases occur. And by doing that, a pattern emerges, much as does the pattern emerge in a detective story.
Epidemiological detectives have turned to Central Africa. There is an unusually high incidence of AIDS cases in Zaire, Burundi, Rwanda, and Chad. And there is a growing consensus that this may be the point of origin of the epidemic. At first, it appeared that AIDS was spread from major American cities to Europe and Australia. Then it appeared that AIDS was brought to this country from the Caribbean. Now scientists speculate that AIDS may have spread first from Africa to Europe and to the Caribbean, and then to the United States. All these theories remain unproven. New patterns emerge.
The United States model for high-risk groups in AIDS is not holding up in all countries. That model applies, namely the homosexual male, the drug addict, the hemophiliac, and so forth, applies in some of the countries in Europe. But it doesn't apply in a country like Haiti, and it doesn't apply in Zaire, where there are many more women diagnosed with the disease, whereas in the United States it's almost exclusively a disease of male homosexuals. In these countries, many more women have it.
Some AIDS cases are linked to a contaminated batch of factor VIII, a substance used to prevent hemophiliacs from bleeding to death. Less than 1% of all AIDS cases in the United States are people with hemophilia A, an inherited disorder confined to men.
Well, I'm 100% sure in my own mind that that's why I contacted AIDS was from factor VIII.
David McKee lives with his wife and 2 daughters in a remote corner of Kentucky. Neighbors have been generous and supportive. Many share his passion for racing dune buggies, a sport David pursued with success, despite the risks involved with his hemophilia.
It's something that I was born with, and there's been a lot of limitations put on what I can do and what I can't. And as a rule, I stay in them limitations. We talk about taking the factor 8, and most people don't realize how that it's administered, that it is intravenously, and it puts the clotting factor back into my blood system.
Currently, factor 8 is an expensive product derived from the blood of thousands of donors.
We knew the risk. I had read up enough on AIDS that I knew he was in a high-risk group. But the chances of him getting the AIDS from the factor was so low that, you know, we didn't think it ever happened. But no, I'm not angry. You can't hate someone because maybe he's got a bad batch of blood, and you can't hate someone because of that, because maybe the donor didn't know that he had AIDS at the time.
When David first showed signs of illness, the local hospital treated him for pneumonia, not knowing that he had AIDS. When his condition worsened, he was referred to the University of Kentucky Medical Center, nearly 100 miles away.
They had done a bronchostomy and took a biopsy of the lung and found out that it had pneumocystis. And, well, pretty well the rest of the story, you know, they knew the rest of the story when I had the pneumocystis. And so then they went ahead and done the blood work, and 2 days later they diagnosed me as having AIDS. You know, I figured that by the time I went to Lexington that, you know, as bad a shape as I was in when I went on up there, that there wasn't much else left for it to be.
Once his diagnosis was confirmed, David was treated for pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. He has recovered from that episode of that opportunistic infection.
But at the time that I was diagnosed, I was so sick that I didn't really care. And so then as I started feeling a little bit better, you know, and really surveyed the situation and what was really taking place, I had already learned to accept it and deal with it.
David's 3-year-old Jonah doesn't understand AIDS. Becky, who is 10, has her own definition of her father's condition.
A person that don't have any immune system, and if you get around someone that has a cold or something, you'll catch the cold and you could die.
We knew that when I married David that this hemophilia wasn't curable. So they come up with the clotting factor. He got along fine. So now he has AIDS. We hope that they will come up with a cure for the AIDS.
You know, I know that the mortality rate on it is high, but my main concern right now is any of these opportunistic diseases come along is deal with each one of them individually.
The hardest thing for me is knowing that I will probably have to face the future with my children by myself. Because with no cure, we know there's no cure in the near future. As far as David getting these opportunistic diseases, it could happen tomorrow. You know, that's the hardest thing. But again, I try not to think about tomorrow, because we have David today, and we hope we have David tomorrow.
Studio is Professor Ron Penny from the AIDS Task Force, and he's the director of the Centre of Immunology at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. Ron, is AIDS an automatic death sentence?
The disease called AIDS, in which patients have severe infections or the cancer shown in the film Kaposi sarcoma, most will invariably die from that. But most people, however, infected with the virus are either very well or have a relatively minor illness with enlargement of their lymph glands, again as shown in the video, who will not die from it. But the AIDS itself is invariably a fatal disease.
Now, we've been told that you can't contract AIDS by casual contact. What evidence is there to support that?
People have looked at the families of patients who have AIDS have looked at people who've cared for patients with AIDS in hospitals, the various healthcare workers, and through ordinary contact, through ordinary social contact, there's really no evidence that the disease has been transmitted through that route. And I think it's very important that the public should not fear through transmission through ordinary meeting and casual contact. And again, neither within the family should people living in the house of a person suffering from AIDS or infected with the AIDS virus should not fear for transmission through ordinary contact.
Well, this latest study that was done in America, where they actually surveyed the family members, and they did such things as sharing meals together. I mean, they even shared toothbrushes, something I could never quite understand, but there wasn't anything that they didn't do together as a normal family. And that was the most significant piece of research that's come to light so far.
That's correct. I think all of the studies, including that one, have clearly highlighted that there is really no risk from ordinary social contact within a family or within the outside world.
But must a patient be treated in isolation like we saw in the film?
It was a bit unfortunate. I think that was unsatisfactory, the implication that, first of all, the child in the plastic bubble did not have AIDS, and patients who were treated for Kaposi sarcoma, one of the patients in the film described that he was in a plastic room. People are not nursed in plastic areas. If they have serious infections, they may need to be in an isolation area. But because there's almost no risk to healthcare workers, it's not really necessary for people to be so utterly isolated as they implied in the film. And in most units that care for a lot of patients with AIDS, it's only at times of blood collection or any operative procedures, for example, that very stringent precautions are then taken.
Well, I suppose really that shows how much more doctors and researchers know about AIDS than, say, they did when that documentary was bought for Australian release towards the end of last year. So that's quite encouraging, which really brings me to the next question. How far off are we from developing a vaccine and or drugs that might be useful in the treatment of AIDS?
Well, at this point of time now, we can treat the infections that develop with people's immune deficiency. So some of those infections, like the pneumonia, are treatable. The skin cancer Kaposi sarcoma is often treatable. What we can't at this point of time now treat is either the immune deficiency or we don't have any drugs that will kill the AIDS virus. There are drugs in the test tube that work, and a lot of these have been announced perhaps prematurely to the public that they have a cure for AIDS. I think it's only by continuing clinical trials which are being set up in this country as well as overseas that we'll really be able to get some reasonable information about the drugs that are being used to kill the AIDS virus. There are quite a number in the test tube that are effective, and I think it will only be a matter of time before we'll have drugs that work in patients. At the moment, we don't have them.
Would you be prepared to put a time on it? Would you say this year or next year?
I don't think I could give a time, but we don't think it's a long, long way away. I think people expect that it may never happen. I think that's wrong. And I don't think we'll have it this year, but it will be within a reasonable time. We expect already quite a number of drugs that are being used that are likely to be either the drug or the forerunner of future drugs. In relationship to vaccines, which is really to protect people who have not been exposed to the virus, genetic engineering already has produced bits and pieces of the virus that can be tested, but we really have a lot more to learn about what's the best part of the virus to use, what's the immunity that we need in the individuals, that the vaccines are safe. And again, like the drugs that will be used to treat the AIDS virus itself, I think a little time is still needed before the vaccines will be available in the community. They have not yet been formally even made available for testing, and I think all of the work now is still being undertaken in experimental animals.
Well, what can we expect, knowing that, what can we expect of the epidemic in, say, the next year or 2 years?
Well, because the incubation period of the disease may be 1 to 2 years, I think anything we do now other than have a drug that kills the virus will not change the overall number of cases over the next year or two. What we have to address is the fact that unquestionably there will be drugs and vaccines available in the coming years, and until then our major effort has to be to control spread of the disease and to try and improve the the well-being of patients who've been infected with the virus, hopefully to minimise the progression of the infection within those patients. I think people will be a little disappointed that for the next year or two, unless there's an antiviral drug, we probably won't have a major impact on the disease. But what we do now will begin to show in 2 years' time. We therefore have to work very hard.
Thanks, Ron.
Pleasure.
There's one important point that I would like to make, and that concerns the blood transfusion service. Now, since May 1985, all blood transfusions throughout Australia have been given the AIDS antibody test, and donors have been required to fill in a questionnaire designed to eliminate at-risk donors. That takes a little extra time, but these steps have made the Australian blood transfusion service among the safest in the world for those giving blood and those receiving it. AIDS has forced people with the disease to grapple with a life and death situation, shattering their lives, often leaving them abandoned and at present with slim hope of recovery. But science has conquered the microbial world before. It does take time, and as Professor Penny has said, AIDS research will continue, and there are some encouraging developments. Now, apart from the medical and scientific work that's being carried out, the National Advisory Committee will continue with its education and communication programs, and currently we're putting the finishing touches to a comprehensive national education program. If you want more information on AIDS, if you're concerned at all, ring this AIDS hotline number. Good night, and thank you for joining us.
I am functioning with cancer working, and there is no reason for me not to work. Medically compromised physicians, one way or another, rejected themselves at risk being, and I just want the opportunity to be with normal people, normal is productive again. And I just want the opportunity to live a full life. I do not accept the premise that I have to sit home and wait to die.
This is Edward Asner. At the time of broadcast, the Centers for Disease Control report more than 5,000 diagnosed cases of AIDS, more than 2,000 fatalities. Young Amar Hamilton, Christopher Shahar in Los Angeles, and David McKee in Kentucky are all reported to be in clinically stable condition. Gerald Barill's condition is described as deteriorating by his physician in New York. Kenneth Brown from Chicago is deceased.